Welcome to So Lounge. Today we're going to be finishing up McCall's 8031 with the buttonholes and the buttons. So if you've been wanting to know how to mark your buttonholes and make sure they're in the right place and get all your buttons lined up, stay tuned. So Lounge is the place for beginners to learn to sew one pattern at a time. Be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. Now, before we take a look at the instructions, make sure that you have pattern piece number 12 handy. And you may not have cut out this piece because its only purpose is to show the markings for the buttons and the buttonholes in the center front. If you don't have this piece cut out, go back to your pattern envelope, pull it out, get it all cut out, and then make sure that it is ironed so it's nice and smooth. You want to get rid of any creases or folds that would prevent this pattern piece from lying on top of the dress smoothly. You also need some marking tools. Now, because this fabric has a texture to it, it does not take tracing paper super well. So I'm going to be using a combination of wax-free tracing paper and a pastel chalk pencil along with my little marking tool. So get those supplies together and let's go in for a closer look. Check out those instructions. We are starting on instruction number 60. This is for all views. We're going to place the guide for the buttonholes on the right front and making sure that the edges of the pattern piece are lined up with the finished edges of the dress. Then we are going to transfer the marks. We're going to start by transferring that center line mark, and then we're going to go back in and make the buttonhole markings. So once we've got that marked, then it just says make buttonholes at markings following instructions and sewing machine manual. And then they recommend using a pin at each end of the buttonhole before we cut it to prevent any problems and accidentally tearing out the buttonhole. Then we're going to move down to step number 61. We're going to lap the opening edges as shown here. And then we are going to match the centers to mark the buttons using the buttonholes as guides, and then we're going to sew the buttons on. Now there's a tip here to use sturdy thread, such as buttonhole twist or carpet thread. If you use all-purpose thread, that will work fine. We're going to do a double thickness when we sew on those buttons, so no worries there. And then this last instruction, 62, is just some sewing tips basically. The thing to note is that this picture is the exact same as the picture up here, and it does not go with the instructions. This is the wrong illustration to go with this instruction. We're just going to ignore it, but I'll walk you through step number 62 to make sure your buttons are in the right place and to get them sewn on so that they'll stay on while you wear your garment. Make sure that you have your dress all ironed and that you've removed any creases or wrinkles along this front edge. It's always a good idea to just iron everything out real quick. Make sure that your dress looks good. If you want to press along this front facing edge to make sure that is nice and crisp, you can do that too. We are going to line up this piece number 12 along the front edge of the dress in accordance with direction number 60. And this is the same for all the different views. And I'm going to put in some pins to hold this in place so that once I start marking, I won't get anything out of whack by accidentally moving or shifting my garment. So I'm just going to be pinning it between the buttonhole markings to make sure it stays. And then we're going to go up this front edge. Now, if the top edge does not match up perfectly, that is fine. I realize that mine does not match up perfectly. So we're not going to worry about that. The buttons are still going to be in the right location. And that's the important part that we're going to be transferring the markings. So put in your last pin up at the top. And then I want to take my wax paper and I'm going to draw in the center front mark because the one I previously drawn in when I first marked all the markings on my pattern is pretty much rubbed off at this point after all the handling. So I'm just going to stick this little piece of tracing paper under here. I'm going to grab my tracing wheel and I'm just going to roll it down this center front line that is marked on my dress. Now this is also going to help later when we need to match up the two sides and overlap them. It's going to make it a lot easier so we can make sure our buttons are in the right place. So just keep doing that. Let's go in for a closer look. This is just a close-up of what I'm doing. As you can see, I have marked that chalk line. Just put your tracing paper underneath that center front line, and then we're just going to go over it with the tracing wheel to make sure that mark transfers through. We want that whole line down the center front. And then next, we're going to go in and mark the individual buttonholes for whatever size you are making. Now, I am making a large. Let's go in a little bit closer. There we go. I am making a size large. So to mark that buttonhole, I'm going to go across the middle of it. And then I'm going to go on the side here. Get that lined up. So you want to mark whichever size corresponds best, and that is what it's going to look like once you have marked it. The second line will be a little bit over from the center front line, as you can see here, and you just need to go in and mark each individual buttonhole. I like to start with the center line and then do the sides, and then we'll go on to the next step. Once you have your buttonholes all marked along the center front of your dress, if some of those marks didn't transfer quite clearly, you can always go back in with a chalk pencil and even them out. A couple of my lines did not go the exact length that they needed to go, so I am going to go back in and mark them in here so that I'll be able to see them once I sit down at the sewing machine. Now, if the thought of sitting down to sew all of these buttonholes is terrifying to you, you can always start with a practice piece of fabric and make the exact same buttonholes until you are confident with your skills and your sewing machine. Now, truthfully, I'm a little stressed out about having to make this many buttonholes and to make them all look nice because they are down the front of the dress. So I am going to take this scrap piece of fabric and I'm going to make the exact same buttonhole markings on it, and I'm going to make them along this fold. So this is a double folded piece of fabric. So it's folded in half. And I'm going to make the markings along this fold so that it'll be the closest thing to what I'm actually going to be sewing on, to make sure that the tension of my machine and the size of the stitches are all correct before I go do it for real on my dress. So we're going to repeat the process of marking the buttonholes. And I'm just, like I said, going to line this up with the front edge. I'm going to do it the exact same way. So I have the fold matched up in the same direction as the fold on my dress. I'm going to just line up some. So I'm probably going to want to do a few just because this stresses me out too. And I'm going to do, how many am I going to do? 5. I'm going to do 5 just because I don't want to mess this up. I know you don't want to mess this up, and it will be easier to just practice before we go in and do the final. Now you can make as many as you want. You can keep doing this until you're confident. And I would recommend at least doing 1 because you never know if your machine is going to make the threads the right size, and I mean the buttonhole thread. So when you look at something that's already made, you'll notice that the threads are very, very tight. So you can't see the fabric underneath. So you want to make sure that your buttons look the same as any store-bought clothing buttonholes. And you might need to practice a little bit with the stitch length and width of your sewing machine, just depending on your make and model. Now I'm going to get these all marked, and then we're going to head to the sewing machine. It's worth it to take the time and practice making some sample buttonholes with your machine to kind of figure out the different variations of the stitch length so that you can make really beautiful, professional, store-bought looking buttonholes. Now the good news is Most sewing machines today have a buttonhole stitch that you can just press a button or turn a dial and get to that stitch, and they all come with buttonhole presser feet. So that's an added bonus and keeps us from having to go in and sew them by hand or use some crazy templates to sew around. This is much easier, and the vintage sewing machines do not have this capability, so be thankful for that. Now, before we get started, make sure that you have an extra bobbin of thread wound and on the side. Buttonholes use a lot of thread, and the last thing you want is to be in the middle of making a buttonhole and have to stop and put more thread on your bobbin and then go back to the beginning. So it's much easier to just have extra bobbin on hand. That's what I thought. I am going to be sewing in this gold colored thread that matches the top stitching on my pockets. I'd like the buttonholes to match, so that's what we're going to do. And before we get started, make sure that you have your buttonhole foot handy, and then you want to check your manual and make sure that there isn't some specific special way to thread your bobbin for buttonhole. Now, with my Bernina, because it is a front load sewing machine, for buttonholes, you need to take the bobbin thread and put it in through this little arm. I think this is kind of standard for most of the front load machines. So if you have a front loading machine, check that out and just make sure that either you do or you don't have to do this step. But if you have a drop-in bobbin, then you probably aren't going to do anything special prior to getting your buttonhole started. It'd be great if I could see this. There we go. Next step is replacing the regular presser foot with your specialized buttonhole presser foot. They all look kind of similar. They're kind of long and rectangular, and some of them have little marks. You might be able to adjust a dial, but basically it's going to slide so that as you're sewing, the guide is moving. So I'm going to get that all lined up. And then very last step before we start sewing is I need to put my machine on the buttonhole setting so that it's ready to start stitching. And now we are going to practice, and let's go in for a closer look. When you are going to be sewing horizontal buttonholes that are perpendicular to the front edge of your dress, we are going to sew them in sideways. It looks like it's sideways. The front of the dress is here, but this is how we are going to go in and make our buttonholes. So to get started, with my Bernina, we start at the top of the buttonhole, we go down, finish the bottom, go back up, and then finish the top. Double check your machine to see the direction that it starts and how it works. I'm going to start by rolling my needle into my fabric, and I am starting, just to kind of show you where I'm starting at the intersection of this horizontal and vertical line over here. So that's where I'm going to put my needle in, and then I'm going to work down to this bottom. And once I reach that intersecting point, then I'm going to change the direction of my needle and go back up the other side. When you are sewing a buttonhole, there should be some kind of indication on your machine of when you need to switch to the next step. Be sure to check your manual so that you know for sure what you need to do. I'm just going to start sewing, and this does move kind of slow, so just take your time. You're just guiding the fabric to make sure everything stays lined up. And then once I get to that bottom mark, let me move that out of the way, see where it is. Not quite there yet. Okay, that looks like it. I'm going to adjust my little marker here on the side. Then I'm going to press the button on my sewing machine to create that bottom bar and then go up the other side. So you can see how you have to change it. And now we are going back up the other side, and the fabric is feeding back out towards me. And as I'm getting up to the top, I'm going to press my button one more time, and then it's going to finish up that top bar. It's going to make 3 little stitches down the stop, and then the needle is going to stop in the up position. So that's how I know it's finished, it's ready to keep going, and that buttonhole is done. Let's cut off these thread tails and take a look at it. So that is basically what it's going to look like. Practice as many times as you need to, and then once you're comfortable, go over to the dress and put in the buttons holes for real. Once you have all of your sample buttonholes sewn, you can start making the real buttonholes on your dress. Just double check that everything is where it is supposed to be and that all your markings have transferred correctly. The other bonus about making some sample buttonholes is you can also practice cutting them open. Now, if we refer back to the instructions, they suggest that you put a pin in one end of the buttonhole, kind of above the little bar that you sewed across, and then using your seam ripper to go in and open that buttonhole, and it'll stop at the pin so you don't accidentally go all the way through. Now, I don't know about you, but my seam ripper is not quite that sharp. So I went in and I just made a little bit of a hole with my seam ripper, and then I got my thread snips, and I'm just gonna go in and very carefully snip out little tiny line of fabric you can see between the buttonholes, and it gives you more control, and then you don't have to worry about that whole pin scenario. You can see that I've got my neat little buttonholes here. I practiced opening them as well, and that is just an added benefit if you have some thread snips or if your seam ripper is not super sharp. So let's go back to the sewing machine. We're gonna sew our buttonholes into place, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so we're back at the sewing machine, and I went through and made 5 sample buttonholes using my fabric to just test out my machine, make sure that I could get them sewn evenly and that they are all the same length. They're not exactly all the same length in the sample, but you know what? Now that I know how to line everything up, I'm ready to actually move forward and put the buttonholes on the front of my dress. So I double checked that all the buttonholes were marked in their correct places, and now I'm ready to get everything lined up with my machine. So I just have my dress going along the back part of my table, and I have the very first buttonholes, the top buttonhole closest to the collar is going to be the one that I start with. So I'm getting everything lined up, and I am getting ready to start stitching. Let's go in for a closer look. For my machine, I am starting with the needle down in my fabric. I have my buttonhole function put on, and I'm going to start stitching the first bar of my buttonhole. And this is the exact same process that I did when I made my sample buttonholes. We're gonna stop right there. Looks good. Now I'm going to press the button again, move on to the bottom bar, and then going back up the other side. Remember, we're not pushing or pulling the fabric as we're making buttonholes. We're just very gently holding on to it to keep everything lined up so that it just does what it's supposed to do. Not to the top yet. Yeah, I think so. There we go. And my needle goes back into the up position once I have finished making the buttonholes. So let's take a look at that. And there we have the buttonhole. It is between the lines. I might want to come back and add a little bit of a stitch there so that it's a little bit longer. I stopped a little too soon, but you know what? It's going to be fine. And I'm going to keep sewing and adjusting accordingly. I don't know about you, but sewing in all those buttonholes was a little bit stressful for me. So now that everything is sewn in, and they look pretty good, they're not 100% perfect, but they're about 95% perfect, so that's pretty good. For the first time I'm really making buttonholes, I usually don't put buttonholes on things. So now that we have them finished, we can go in and trim all of these loose threads off to just kind of clean everything up a little bit. And then we want to go in and open all of our buttonholes because we need them to be open when we go and place the buttons where they need to be, so then we can sew them on. So I'm going to use my thread snips in combination with my seam ripper. Let's go in for a closer look. As you can see, all my buttonholes are finished. The next step is to put in a pin, which is optional if you were using thread snips, but if you are not using thread snips, you definitely want to use a pin to make sure that you stop your seam ripper. The instructions just indicate you should run your seam ripper over to the pin and then you'll have it opened. My seam ripper isn't super sharp and I'm not super confident with that method. I'm going to use my thread snips, make the hole with the seam ripper, and now I'm just going to go across and very carefully snip those threads down the middle between these two stitch lines until I get to the pin, and as you can see, now it is open. I'm just going to repeat that process with each buttonhole until they're all finished. If you want to use the seam ripper method and you're confident that you can stop or the pin will stop you, feel free. This is just the method I generally use. I think it's a little bit safer and it's always a good idea to just err on the side of caution so you don't destroy your garment. Now that your buttonholes have been cut open, the next step is to fold the flap. We're moving to step number 61, which says lap opening edges as shown, matching centers. Now, to do that, we need to have a center mark on the left side front of our dress. So if yours rubbed off during the sewing process, which mine did, you need to go back in and mark it so that you know where to line up the two front edges. Now to do that, you're just going to flip the pattern piece over so the right side is down, and then we're going to repeat the process that we previously used to transfer the marks using chalk paper and a tracing wheel, and I put mine away. So we're just going to go back and do that, and then we will continue to the next step. So the next step is to line up these center fronts. We are still on step number 61. Now that we have them marked on both sides, we can go in through one side down to the bottom, catch the line, and then come back up so that our line is in the right place so that both lines match up on either side of the front panels. Now, once we have that done, next we're going to go in and we are going to mark the buttonholes against the center line. Now, the reason we're doing this is because once we unpin, we need to know where to place the specific buttons to correspond with each buttonhole. So that's why we're doing this. The directions are kind of unclear on exactly what we're supposed to do. I've been going back and forth with this to figure out the best way to show you how to do it, because step 61 just says lap opening edges as shown, matching centers, and then just says using buttonholes as a guide, make button markings on left front. They just think that you're going to just know that we're using the center front. Now, I went to a reference book for sewing, and it says that unless otherwise stated in the pattern, you want to use that center line as the point for your buttons. So that is going to be a little bit more clarification from the pattern instructions. And as a general rule, you want to use the center back line or the center front line, center front in this case, for button placement unless otherwise indicated. So I'm assuming that's what that matching centers means. We want to put the button here and get it all lined up. So once we know where the buttons need to be, finish marking the rest of the buttonholes on your garment, and then we'll go do some hand sewing. All right, so we are going to do some hand sewing. You will need a thimble, you will need a needle and your thread and your button, or 8 buttons actually. Now these are 5/8 inch buttons. The size of the button is going to be on the back of the little card. Sometimes it's on the front, so just double check. You need to make sure you are using the button size recommended by your pattern, because the size of a buttonhole is very correlated to the size of the button. So if you use a bigger button and you use the buttonhole markings on the pattern, it's not going to work. The buttons aren't going to fit through. They're not going to be the right size. So make sure you do that. And once you get your needle threaded, you want to fold it on itself and then tie a knot so that both ends have a knot in them. So it's just a single knot, but tied at the very bottom of the doubled up thread. We want to have some thicker thread when we go in and put in these buttons to make sure that they stay secure. And then that way it avoids having to go buy special buttonhole thread, which may or may not come in the color that you want. So to get started, we're going to go in from the back of the dress. So from the inside of the dress, come out at the mark where the 2 lines intersect, and then I'm going to grab my button, slide it on. Let's go in for a closer look. I have my thread coming through at the intersecting point. If you look at the instructions, it says to put a pin in at that point. And then basically we're going to sew the button around it. I have the thread going up through my button through one of these holes. And the way that I want to do this is I'm going to put the holes so that there's 2 holes on that same line. So 2 holes going horizontally, 2 holes going vertically. And we're going to line that up over that pin mark. So that way you can see in there, the needle's going to go around the straight pin. And then that will help create a little shank. Now, a shank is going to be the little thread piece that is going to be between the button and the garment, and that will just help it have a little bit more give when you put it in and out of the buttonhole. I'm just going to go through a couple of times, and it's kind of however much you want. I like to do it so that it's going to be nice and thick. I don't want my buttons coming off. So just take a look at that. Let's see if that's good. That looks pretty good. So now I am going to go up through the top and then go across to the bottom, still keeping those little holes lined up along the line. And I am still on top of this pin. And that'll make a little bit more sense in a second. If you want to learn about sewing buttons in more detail, you can check out this video. I'm going to point to it. There we go. It'll be up here. And go learn more about buttons, and I will show you specifically how to sew them on step by step in a little more detail than this video. Let me just go around one more time. Honey came to say hi. Hello, honey. No, we're not going outside. Okay, so we're just finishing up. You can see we have a little cross on the back. And then when we're done, we're going to come out the side, but we're not going to go back through the fabric. So this is how we make the shank. And we can take the pin out at this point, and you can see that there's a little bit of give in there. We're going to finish this off by looping around and then going through the loop. And that's going to add some extra little threads that's going to let the button move a little bit. So it's not going to be super tight when we try and get it through that buttonhole. So I'm just going to do this 3 times. And then I'm going to snip off this thread. And then my button is connected. You can see it's still lined up with the center front mark and the other side. Let's flip it over and see how it works with the buttonhole. Fingers crossed. Everything is where it needs to be. Goes through there. And there we go. Just keep sewing them all on until you're finished. So now you know how to mark the buttonholes and the buttons and sew everything together to finish your dress. If you've been following along with McCall's 8031, this is the very last step, so congratulations, you've done it. Now I still have 4 more buttons to sew on, but I have everything marked and ready to go, so that won't take too long. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions but no one to answer them, head on over to Let's Talk Sewing for Beginners, hosted by Sew Lounge. It's an interactive Facebook group where you can ask all the questions you want and I will get you some answers. There is a link in the description below, so click and join today. Until we meet again, happy sewing!